Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, February 19th, 2021, and I'm sure as many of you guys know or don't know, I'm going to let you run through it right now. Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, someone who's well known amongst the American electorate, went on a trip to Cancun with his daughters amidst a natural disaster that hit Texas, their first, huge snowstorm in quite some time now that wiped out power for millions of Texas residents. And this was viewed as ultimately Ted Cruz abandoning ship, abandoning his constituents. And no matter which way you look at it, when these images were released of Ted Cruz boarding an aircraft to go to Cancun, Mexico, when there were millions of residents without power, there were people freezing to death in their homes without water. And this senator goes on a trip to Mexico. Now, I know it may seem as if this is something that just seems to be a partisan attack on a senator who's trying to get away, trying to vacation for once, right? As a public servant, but not in a moment of crisis. And the thing is, this has just come up at such a poor time. Politically speaking, there is no defense for this. And Ted Cruz's defense made it even worse. I typically don't go with Chris Cillizza's points, but looking at the, I typically don't cover exactly what he releases, but his headline was absolutely true. This did make matters worse. He essentially pinned this trip saying he was dropping off his daughters on his trip to Cancun. I mean, it didn't really make sense, and he pretty much pinned it on them. And they're also 10, 12 years old. They're not old enough to actually, have that idea that they were the ones who single-handedly pushed Ted Cruz to go to Cancun. The explanation just made it seem as if he was pinning it on his daughters. And I know this may seem like something that won't, be too important. Had this been any other type of thing, traveling certainly has been not recommended by the CDC, but I don't think this would have hurt his re-election chances. But the fact that Texas is currently undergoing one of their biggest natural disasters, in modern history, this is something that is directly impacting every citizen in Texas. Besides maybe 1-2% of the population, every citizen in Texas. There are countless personal reports. If you're from Texas, I'm sure you know someone, or you personally, who were out of power, out of water. The stores have been completely scrapped. Looking at Ted Cruz just going on a vacation, well, this is something that could be comparable to what happened when Gavin Newsom went and had a dinner, defying his own COVID-19 restrictions. And on top of this, defying COVID-19 restrictions, Ted Cruz seemingly is abandoning his own constituents. And I think that these two images will go down in infamy, and they will be used against him in 2024. Absolutely. If he chooses to run for re-election, I find no way he can get out of this as a talking point in a debate. It may seem like it won't be important, but this is something that many Texans will remember. They will remember when their entire power grid was out of power. They will remember when they were, freezing in their own homes, when they had to go to a neighbor's home, when they had to go to a family member's home to get water, to get basic necessities. This is something that will drastically hurt his re-election bid, as if it wasn't going to be difficult already. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at. Let's go ahead and take a look at Ted Cruz. His name actually has been floated not just because of this, but because of the Capitol insurrection. You see, despite everything that occurred, all of the criticism that Ted Cruz had given Donald Trump leading up to his election, he made a complete 180. In fact, further than that. I mean, he went from going at a point where he was criticizing Trump, calling him a con man, saying he was wrong for the country, to voting against the electoral certification in key battleground states, even after the Capitol insurrection. Some of which, some people would argue, encouraged the behavior at the Capitol. And looking at what happens, his name with Josh Hawley, they were the two biggest proponents of this lie that the election was rigged, and ultimately will and did hurt their approval ratings amongst their respective bases. Let's take a look. The Morning Consult used to do a routine polling data. We're actually going to be using them for a jump back in history to see how the approval rating laid out before. But looking at the approve versus disapproval rating of Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, what happens is, after this point in time, Ted Cruz's approval rating took a dip. Before this, he had an 81% approval rating amongst Republicans. Following the Capitol insurrection, following his vote to defy the will of the voters, what happens is his approval rating drops, not just amongst Republicans, but amongst the people in Texas. Comes down to a point where he's just approved of by 1 percentage point. I can't imagine it'd be too much higher now. In fact, I think he's going to end up dipping down below as a result of these new revelations about him traveling to Cancun, Mexico. No matter what side of the political aisle you're on, this is bad optics. No matter who says it. Ben Shapiro said it himself. This is bad optics. Politics is optics. And looking at, and I don't ever cite Ben Shapiro for reference, but looking at this, no matter where you are, no matter where you stand, there's no defense to leaving your constituents. There's no defense when your constituents are at home, when your constituents are freezing. This is something that Texas was not used to. The infrastructure wasn't built for it. It just simply wasn't, which is why many people are putting the blame on the politicians here. Specifically Ted Cruz, specifically Greg Abbott, specifically John Cornyn, specifically the Republican representatives, the Democratic representatives, whoever's in power in your district, in your state. You are going to be held responsible. It just so happens that there are more Republicans in office in Texas, well, because it's a Republican state. But looking at Ted Cruz's approval rating following the Capitol insurrection, he may have been approved of by 7 points by his constituents. Now it's up by 1, and after this, I expect it to dip significantly. But that's not it. That's not just it. The approval rating isn't the only thing that matters entering into your re-election bid. You see, the thing about Ted Cruz was that in 2018, he actually had a very high approval rating. Let's take a look. The month before he was re-elected to the United States Senate, they did a poll. How do Texan voters view Ted Cruz as a senator? Well, the reason why nobody really expected Beto O'Rourke to even be competitive is because even a month out, Ted Cruz had a plus 14% approval rating. President Trump only had plus 6. Ted Cruz had always remained above the fray, and still does. Donald Trump is disapproved of in Texas, while Ted Cruz is still narrowly approved of. We don't have any data following the new revelations, but I can expect it to still remain higher than Donald Trump's. But looking at Ted Cruz being plus 14% in October of 2018, when this poll was released, that was a very good sign for the GOP's re-election chances in that state. Honestly, it was a very good sign. But looking at what ended up happening was the race was super competitive. In fact, it was the closest Senate race since 1978. This was a race where Ted Cruz won by just shy under 3 percentage points. Actually, it was 2.4 percentage points. It wasn't by a lot, and Ted Cruz was almost defeated by someone who was relatively unknown just 2 years prior. Beto O'Rourke, a little-known representative from Texas. But what he did was visited every single county in the state. What he did was made these people feel as if their voices were heard. One cannot deny Beto O'Rourke was a very good campaigner. I acknowledged that when I made my predictions. I acknowledged that when I was covering this Texas Senate race. But at the end of the day, it was still Texas, and Ted Cruz had an astounding approval rating. But even with that approval rating, it wasn't enough to win by 14 points. It was a victory of 2.4 percentage points. I mean, looking at the, or 2.6 percentage points, looking at the margin here, it was honestly so poor for Ted Cruz relative to Donald Trump's performances. 2.6% versus what was this year, 5.6%. 2016, 9 percentage points. Mitt Romney, 16 percentage points. We can take a look through history about how Texas has rapidly gotten more Democratic as the years progress. Ted Cruz was he experienced a blue wave in Texas. We can take a look at the House vote, a perfect example of this. In 2016, the Republicans won the House vote by 20 percentage points. In 2018, they won it by 3 percentage points. Looking at 2018, if you compare the 2012 victories, Ted Cruz won by 16 percentage points. 2018, he won by 3 percentage points. I mean, the race got significantly closer. And the fact is, Texas will be more pro-Democratic in 2024 than in any year prior in modern political history. With the exception of a victory of Jimmy Carter, Republicans dominated in Texas. Republicans have dominated here since the realignment period in the 1960s. And looking at the victory here for Ted Cruz, this was one of the most lackluster performances for a GOP candidate in Texas history, in Texas modern history. And looking at what's ahead in 2024, I don't expect him to do as well. If anything, he could lose. And looking at these new things that are being discussed, this is going to haunt him. No matter what happens, even if he decides to run for president or he ends up as the vice presidential ticket, this will haunt him because there is no explanation for this. There are certain things that happen with politicians. Outside of the realm of Donald Trump, these candidates, these politicians will have these one few things that will follow them for decades. And I do think that this is something that could follow Ted Cruz. I don't think I'm exaggerating what's happening here. There's a reason why the media blew up all over it. There's a reason why Fox News for a short time being, didn't cover it, because they knew that this is something that would be viewed extremely negative by the press, extremely negative by the American people. And they were right. And it is viewed extremely negative by the American people, by the Texas residents who are in their homes. And many of them are going to remember this time period. Remember this time where they did not have plowed roads, where their state wasn't built for a snowstorm. And Ted Cruz is going to have to come back to these voters in 24 and say, he can't say I was there. He certainly cannot say I was there. He might be now, but he can't say I was there after this. This could easily be released in an attack ad. And it's, it just really didn't make sense because Ted Cruz grappling on to Donald Trump. I would say that grappling on to Donald Trump, looking at the way that Donald Trump was treated by Ted Cruz previously versus now, it was a complete turnaround. And it doesn't really make sense. You see, Donald Trump won Texas by just 5.6 percentage points. People compare Texas to California, but realistically, they're nowhere even near in comparison. Democrats win California by 30. Republicans win Texas by 5. They win Texas by 3. They win Texas by 2. Looking at the trajectory of Texas over the past few years, at the end of the day, if anyone was supposed to do well here, it should have been Ted Cruz. If anyone was supposed to do well here, it should have been Ted Cruz with a higher approval rating amongst Republicans, amongst Democrats, amongst independents than Donald Trump. But it wasn't enough for him to win by even a likely margin. And looking at the 2020 results, I just simply don't understand why Ted Cruz would want to jump on to Donald Trump the same way that he's doing right now. It just does not make sense. Donald Trump is someone who narrowed the state for the Democratic Party. Ted Cruz almost lost because of Donald Trump, not because of anyone else. Had Hillary Clinton been president, Ted Cruz would have won this Senate race by 15 percentage points at least. Donald Trump seems to be harming the GOP specifically in Texas, but Ted Cruz doesn't seem to be recognizing that. For someone who was a huge, opposition candidate to Donald Trump, runner-up in the 2016 Republican primary, he has since completely pledged his allegiance to President Trump. And at the end of the day, that's not something that will work in a state that has been consistently getting more and more Democratic. 2004, for reference, Bush won the state by 22.9%. In Obama's landslide year, 66.7% of the electoral vote went to Obama in this year. What happened? Texas still went to McCain by 11.8%. In a landslide, McCain still won by larger than Trump twice. 2012, it returns to being a safe state. Texas, more Democratic than 2004, not more than 2008, but Romney wins it by 15.8%. But fast forward to 2016, Donald Trump loses a lot of that support. 52% of the vote, just a 9-point victory over Secretary Clinton. In 2020, President Trump wins it again, but by 5.6%. If we compare the previous elections, let's go 2020 to 2004, look at that swing. 17.3% swing. Relative to 2008, a 6-point swing. 2012, a 10-point swing. 2016, a 3-point swing. And as the state gets more and more and more Democratic, as it has been, Ted Cruz is going to be in a much more vulnerable position in 2024, especially if we see a similar amount of energy like what we saw in 2018. If Republicans nominate someone who's lackluster, or if they nominate Donald Trump again, you can guarantee it that anti-Trump vote will still be there. When voters voted against Donald Trump and people are saying that's not a reliable base to win off of, you're right. They need to focus on policy, but if Trump runs again in 2024, anti-Trump votes are going to be the same votes that the Democratic Party will need to continue to hold the Senate, if they continue to hold it in 2022, to either win back or control the United States House of Representatives. Just looking at the election results in Texas over the past 2 decades, it has gotten more and more and more Democratic now that we have one of the closest races in Texas in 50 years. The closest in 50 years in 2018. 2024 could be even closer. Ted Cruz's approval rating is undoubtedly going to take a dip. And it would really matter if it did. Because right now he's at 45 to 44, a net approval of 1. In 2018, when he won by just 2.6%, he was approved of by 14 percentage points by his constituents. A 14-point approval still almost made you lose. Can you imagine what net positive 1 or even negative could mean? This isn't a good look. His explanation didn't make sense. His reasoning for, there was just no way to respond to this. And that's the predicament that he's in. I don't think Ted Cruz could have said any explanation that could have defended this. None whatsoever. Texas is hurting right now. Texas has some very real issues that need to be addressed. After this snowstorm goes away, what's saying something, couldn't come back later? The infrastructure problem needs to be fixed. Looking at Texas as its own individual state, a lot of these constituents here are going to be very upset with Ted Cruz. Many of them already are. Many Republicans are upset with what Ted Cruz has done. And looking at the state's demographic trend, the reason why it's getting more and more Democratic is because we are seeing an influx of minority voters in the major cities, minority voters around the state, combined with Donald Trump speeding up the state's trajectory towards the Democratic Party. There's no, it's no surprise that Republicans down ballot perform better than Trump statewide in Texas than Donald Trump does. Not when he's not on the ballot, but when he is on the ballot, that's exactly what we see. And looking at the state's trajectory, 4 years after 4 years after 4 years, Donald Trump, demographic shifts, it's the perfect storm for Texas to get more Democratic. No matter who you support, you can't deny that a 5.6% victory in a state that used to be won by safe margins is anything to brag about. Yes, Democrats thought it would be more competitive. Yes, I thought it would be more competitive than it actually was. However, it was still pretty darn competitive. 5.6%, yeah, that's not a good look for an incumbent Republican in Texas. The Democrats are winning, California by 30. They're winning New York by 23. Texas just didn't make sense. It makes sense based off everything that we've seen. But if I had told you this in 2012 or you had told any real political pundit then, they would have said you're crazy. But looking at what happened and looking what's continuing to happen is that the demographic groups in these states, we are seeing a growth in terms of the minority vote, specifically the Hispanic vote. It's a vote that Donald Trump did surprisingly better. If you take a look at the majority-minority Hispanic counties or just majority-minority counties, what you will see across this southern border is that they all shifted to the right. And even then, Donald Trump won by a smaller margin because it was, outdone by counties with much more votes. Smaller amount of votes, but it's definitely an indicator that the Hispanic vote, Starr County right here, 55 points more Republican. If you take a look at that, that's very interesting. Hillary Clinton did surprisingly well amongst Hispanic voters, and Democrats were foolish to assume that they would hold on to it. But in 2024, if Trump isn't on the ballot, and if this whole socialism message, which has certainly been pushed by the Trump campaign, by the Republican Party, doesn't end up actually doing anything, what we are going to see is this voting bloc return to Democratic support. And because Donald Trump has pushed away many of these suburban voters, many of these white woman voters, white male voters, they are going to also possibly remain with the Democratic Party. Because the damage has been done by Donald Trump. The damage has been done. The damage has been done by senators like Josh Hawley and senators like Ted Cruz. If he was looking to win a state in a swing state, he should not have treated the electoral certification the way he did. He should not have gone on a vacation to Cancun, making an explanation, throwing his daughters under the bus. When he takes a look at the election history, Texas was competitive in 2020. He almost lost. The trajectory is Texas is getting bluer. And for someone who did better than Trump in the primary and still almost came up short, I'm surprised he wasn't more centrist and more, pandering than he's doing right now. Because he's halfway through his term right now. I believe this is his second term. If you look at his election history before, in 2012, there's a Republican before him, I believe, Kay Bailey Hutchinson. But looking at his margin, what happened is he was able to win 56.5% of the vote. 56.5% of the vote in 2012. 2018, he won just 50.9% of the vote. The Democrats went from just 40.6% of the vote. to ending up getting 48.3% of the vote. And it wasn't as if Beto O'Rourke was a statewide official, someone who had won before in Texas outside of his district. No, that wasn't true. Ted Cruz, was just someone who was popular at the time, but couldn't match the moment. He was able to win, but not by a lot. But I'm sure 6 years from now, or 6 years from then, and 3 years from now, he is going to be in a very difficult position. Because nothing about his history, outside of his criticism of President Trump prior to the 2016 general election, prior to then, during the primary season, that's the only thing he has going for him in order to win back these voters that moved away from the Republican Party because of Trump, because of Hawley, and partially because of Cruz. And this just only adds, even more wood to the fire. It just makes it even more difficult for Ted Cruz to overcome an electoral hurdle in 2024 that will be a competitive Texas. It's honestly just too much, I think, in 2024 for Ted Cruz to be the immediate favorite. He is going to be in for one of the most competitive races in Texas, and that's saying something, considering 2018 was the most competitive in half a century. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.